Story 15 of The Room in the Tower and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Noel Vox. The Room in the Tower and Other Stories by E.F. Benson. The Other Bed. I had gone out to Switzerland just before Christmas, expecting, from experience, a month of divinely renovating weather, of skating all day in brilliant sun, and basking in the hot frost of that windless atmosphere. Occasionally, as I knew, there might be a snowfall, which would last perhaps for 48 hours at the outside, and would be succeeded by another 10 days of cloudless perfection, cold even to zero at night, but irradiated all day long by the unflecked splendor of the sun. Instead, the climatic conditions were horrible. Day after day a gale screamed through this upland valley that should have been so windless and serene, bringing with it a tornado of sleet that changed to snow by night. For 10 days there was no abatement of it, and evening after evening, as I consulted my barometer, feeling sure that the black finger would show that we were coming to the end of these abominations, I found that it had sunk a little lower yet, till it stayed like a homing pigeon on the S of storm. I mention these things in depreciation of the story that follows, in order that the intelligent reader may say at once, if he wishes, that all that occurred was merely a result of the malaise of nerves and digestion that perhaps arose from those storm-bound and disturbing conditions. And now to go back to the beginning again. I had written to engage a room at the Hotel Beausite, and had been agreeably surprised on arrival to find that for the modest sum of 12 francs a day, I was allotted a room on the first floor with 2 beds in it. Otherwise the hotel was quite full. Fearing to be billeted in a 22-franc room by mistake, I instantly confirmed my arrangements at the bureau. There was no mistake. I had ordered a 12-franc room, and had been given one. The very civil clerk hoped that I was satisfied with it, for otherwise there was nothing vacant. I hasten to say that I was more than satisfied, fearing the fate of Esau. I arrived about 3 in the afternoon of a cloudless and glorious day, the last of the series. I hurried down to the rink, having had the prudence to put skates in the forefront of my luggage, and spent a divine but struggling hour or two, coming up to the hotel about sunset. I had letters to write, and after ordering tea to be sent up to my gorgeous apartment, number 23 on the first floor, I went straight up there. The door was ajar, and I feel certain I should not even remember this now, except in the light of what followed. Just as I got close to it, I heard some faint movement inside the room, and instinctively knew that my servant was there unpacking. Next moment I was in the room myself, and it was empty. The unpacking had been finished, and everything was neat, orderly, and comfortable. My barometer was on the table, and I observed with dismay that it had gone down nearly half an inch. I did not give another thought to the movement I thought I had heard from outside. Certainly I had a delightful room for my 12 francs a day. There were, as I have said, 2 beds in it, on one of which were already laid out my dress clothes, while night things were disposed on the other. There were 2 windows, between which stood a large washing stand with plenty of room on it. A sofa with its back to the light stood conveniently near the pipes of central heating. There were a couple of good armchairs, a writing table, and, rarest of luxuries, another table, so that every time one had breakfast it was not necessary to pile up a drift of books and papers to make room for the tray. My room looked east, and sunset still flamed on the western faces of the virgin snows, while above, in spite of the dejected barometer, the sky was bare of clouds, and a thin slip of pale crescent moon was swung high among the stars that still burned dimly in these first moments of their kindling. Tea came up for me without delay, and as I ate I regarded my surroundings with extreme complacency. Then, quite suddenly, and without cause, I saw that the disposition of the beds would never do. I could not possibly sleep in the bed that my servant had chosen for me. I jumped up, transferred my dress clothes to the other bed, and put my night things where they had been. It was done breathlessly almost, and not till then did I ask myself why I had done it. I found I had not the slightest idea. I had merely felt that I could not sleep in the other bed. But having made the change, I felt perfectly content. My letters took me an hour or so to finish, and I had yawned and blinked considerably over the last one or two, in part from their inherent dullness, in part from quite natural sleepiness, for I had been in the train for 24 hours, and was fresh to the bracing airs which so conduced to appetite, activity, and sleep. And as there was still an hour before I need dress, I lay down on my sofa with a book for excuse, but the intention to slumber as reason, and consciousness ceased as if a tap had been turned off. Then I dreamed. I dreamed that my servant came very quietly into the room, to tell me, no doubt, that it was time to dress. I suppose there were a few minutes to spare yet, and that he saw I was dozing, for instead of rousing me, he moved quietly about the room, setting things in order. The light appeared to me to be very dim, for I could not see him with any distinctness. Indeed, I only knew it was he because it could not be anybody else. Then he paused by my washing stand, which had a shelf for brushes and razors above it, and I saw him take a razor from its case and begin stropping it. The light was strongly reflected on the blade of the razor. He tried the edge once or twice on his thumbnail, and then, to my horror, I saw him trying it on his throat. Instantaneously one of those deafening dream crashes awoke me, and I saw the door half open, and my servant in the very act of coming in. No doubt the opening of the door had constituted the crash. I had joined a previously arrived party of 5, all of us old friends, and accustomed to see each other often. And at dinner and afterwards, in intervals of bridge, the conversation roamed agreeably over a variety of topics, rocking turns and the prospects of weather, a thing of vast importance in Switzerland and not a commonplace subject, and the performances at the opera, and under what circumstances, as revealed in Dummy's hand, is it justifiable for a player to refuse to return his partner's original lead in No Trumps. Then, over whiskey and soda, and the repeated last cigarette, it veered back via the Zanzigs to thought transference and the transference of emotion. Here, one of the party, Harry Lambert, put forward the much-discussed explanation of haunted houses based on this principle. He put it very concisely. Everything that happens, he said, whether it is a step we take or a thought that crosses our mind, makes some change in its immediate material world. Now, the most violent and concentrated emotion we can imagine is the emotion that leads a man to take so extreme a step as killing himself or somebody else. I can easily imagine such a deed so eating into the material scene, the room, or the haunted heath where it happens, that its mark lasts an enormous time. The air rings with the cry of the slain, and still drips with his blood. It is not everybody who will perceive it, but sensitives will. By the way, I am sure that man who waits on us at dinner is a sensitive. It was already late, and I rose. Let us hurry to the scene of the crime, I said. For myself, I shall hurry to the scene of sleep. Outside, the threatening promise of the barometer was already finding fulfillment, and a cold, ugly wind was complaining among the pines, and hooting round the peaks, and snow had begun to fall. The night was thickly overcast, and it seemed as if uneasy presences were going to and fro in the darkness. But there was no use in ill augury, and certainly if we were to be housebound for a few days, I was lucky in having so commodious a lodging. I had plenty to occupy myself with indoors, though I should vastly have preferred to be engaged outside, and in the immediate present, how good it was to lie free in a proper bed after a cramped night in the train. I was half undressed when there came a tap at my door, and the waiter, who had served us at dinner, came in carrying a bottle of whiskey. He was a tall young fellow, and though I had not noticed him at dinner, I saw at once now, as he stood in the glare of the electric light, what Harry had meant when he said he was sure he was a sensitive. There is no mistaking that look. It is exhibited in a peculiar in-looking of the eye. Those eyes, one knows, see further than the surface. "The bottle of whiskey for monsieur," he said, putting it down on the table. "But I ordered no whiskey," said I. He looked puzzled. "Number 23, he said. Then he glanced at the other bed. "Ah, for the other gentleman, without doubt," he said. "But there is no other gentleman," said I. "I am alone here." He took up the bottle again. "Pardon, monsieur," he said. "There must be a mistake. I am new here. I only came today. But I thought—" "Yes," said I. "I thought that number 23 had ordered a bottle of whiskey," he repeated. "Good night, monsieur, and pardon." I got into bed, extinguished the light, and feeling very sleepy and heavy with the oppression, no doubt, of the snow that was coming, expected to fall asleep at once. Instead, my mind would not go quite to roost, but kept sleepily stumbling about among the little events of the day, as some tired pedestrian in the dark stumbles over stones instead of lifting his feet. And as I got sleepier, it seemed to me that my mind kept moving in a tiny little circle. At one moment it drowsily recollected how I had thought I had heard movement inside my room. At the next it remembered my dream of some figure going stealthily about and stropping a razor. At a third it wondered why this Swiss waiter, with the eyes of a sensitive, thought that number 23 had ordered a bottle of whiskey. But at the time I made no guess as to any coherence between these little isolated facts. I only dwelt on them with drowsy persistence. Then a fourth fact came to join the sleepy circle, and I wondered why I had felt a repugnance against using the other bed. But there was no explanation of this forthcoming either, and the outlines of thought grew more blurred and hazy until I lost consciousness altogether. Next morning began the series of awful days. Sleet and snow falling relentlessly with gusts of chilly wind, making any out-of-door amusement next to impossible. The snow was too soft for tobogganing. It balled on the skies, and as for the rink, it was but a series of pools of slushy snow. This in itself, of course, was quite enough to account for any ordinary depression and heaviness of spirit, but all the time I felt there was something more than that to which I owed the utter blackness that hung over these days. I was beset too by fear that at first was only vague, but which gradually became more definite until it resolved itself into a fear of number 23, and in particular, a terror of the other bed. I had no notion why or how I was afraid of it. The thing was perfectly causeless, but the shape and the outline of it grew slowly clearer, and as detail after detail of ordinary life, each minute and trivial in itself, carved and molded this fear till it became definite. Yet the whole thing was so causeless and childish that I could speak to no one of it. I could but assure myself that it was all a figment of nerves disordered by this unseemly weather. However, as to the details, there were plenty of them. Once I woke up from strangling nightmare, unable at first to move, but in a panic of terror, believing that I was sleeping in the other bed. More than once, too, awaking before I was called and getting out of bed to look at the aspect of the morning, I saw with a sense of dreadful misgiving that the bedclothes on the other bed were strangely disarranged, as if someone had slept there and smoothed them down afterwards, but not so well as to give notice of the occupation. So one night I laid a trap, so to speak, for the intruder, of which the real object was to calm my own nervousness, for I still told myself that I was frightened of nothing, and tucked in the sheet very carefully, laying the pillow on the top of it. But in the morning it seemed as if my interference had not been to the taste of the occupant, for there was more impatient disorder than usual in the bedclothes, and on the pillow was an indentation, round and rather deep, such as we may see any morning in our own beds. Yet by day these things did not frighten me, but it was when I went to bed at night that I quaked at the thought of further developments. It happened also from time to time that I wanted something brought to me, or wanted my servant. On 3 or 4 of these occasions my bell was answered by the sensitive, as we called him, but the sensitive, I noticed, never came into the room. He would open the door a chink to receive my order, and on returning would again open it a chink to say that my boots, or whatever it was, were at the door. Once I made him come in, but I saw him cross himself as, with a face of icy terror, he stepped into the room, and the sight somehow did not reassure me. Twice also he came up in the evening, when I had not rung at all, even as he came up the first night, and opened the door a chink to say that my bottle of whiskey was outside. But the poor fellow was in such a state of bewilderment when I went out and told him that I had not ordered whiskey that I did not press for an explanation. He begged my pardon profusely. He thought a bottle of whiskey had been ordered for number 23. It was his mistake entirely. I should not be charged for it. It must have been the other gentleman. Pardon again. He remembered there was no other gentleman. The other bed was unoccupied. It was on the night when this happened for the second time that I definitely began to wish that I, too, was quite certain that the other bed was unoccupied. The 10 days of snow and sleet were at an end, and tonight the moon once more, grown from a mere slip to a shining shield, swung serenely among the stars. But though at dinner everyone exhibited an extraordinary change of spirit with the rising of the barometer and the discharge of this huge snowfall, the intolerable gloom, which had been mine so long, but deepened and blackened. The fear was to me now like some statue, nearly finished, modelled by the carving hands of these details, and though it still stood below its moistened sheet, any moment, I felt, the sheet might be twitched away and I be confronted with it. Twice that evening I had started to go to the bureau to ask to have a bed made up for me, anywhere, in the billiard room or the smoking room, since the hotel was full, but the intolerable childishness of the proceeding revolted me. What was I afraid of? A dream of my own? A mere nightmare? Some fortuitous disarrangement of bed linen? The fact that a Swiss waiter made mistakes about bottles of whiskey? It was an impossible cowardice. But equally impossible that night were billiards or bridge or any form of diversion. My only salvation seemed to lie in downright hard work, and soon after dinner I went to my room in order to make my first real counter-move against fear, and sat down solidly to several hours of proof-correcting, a medial and monotonous employment, but one which is necessary and engages the entire attention. But first I looked thoroughly round the room to reassure myself, and found all modern and solid. A bright paper of daisies on the wall, a floor parquet, the hot water pipes chuckling to themselves in the corner, my bedclothes turned down for the night, the other bed. The electric light was burning brightly, and there seemed to me to be a curious stain, as of a shadow, on the lower part of the pillow and the top of the sheet, definite and suggestive, and for a moment I stood there again, throttled by a nameless terror. Then, taking my courage in my hands, I went closer and looked at it. Then I touched it. The sheet where the stain or shadow was seemed damp to the hand. So also was the pillow. And then I remembered I had thrown some wet clothes on the bed before dinner. No doubt that was the reason. And fortified by this extremely simple dissipation of my fear, I sat down and began on my proofs. But my fear had been this, that the stain had not in that first moment looked like the mere grayness of water-moistened linen. From below at first came the sound of music, for they were dancing tonight, but I grew absorbed in my work and only recorded the fact that after a long time there was no more music. Steps went along the passages, and I heard the buzz of conversation on landings and the closing of doors till by degrees the silence became noticeable. The loneliness of night had come. It was after the silence had become lonely that I made the first pause in my work, and by the watch on my table saw that it was already past midnight. But I had little more to do. Another half hour would see the end of the business, but there were certain notes I had to make for future reference, and my stock of paper was already exhausted. However, I had bought some in the village that afternoon, and it was in the bureau downstairs, where I had left it when I came in and had subsequently forgotten to bring it upstairs. It would be the work of a minute only to get it. The electric light had brightened considerably during the last hour, owing no doubt to many burners being put out in the hotel, and as I left the room I saw again the stain on the pillow and sheet of the other bed. I had really forgotten all about it for the last hour, and its presence there came as an unwelcome surprise. Then I remembered the explanation of it, which had struck me before, and for purposes of self-reassurement I again touched it. It was still damp, but had I got chilly with my work? For it was warm to the hand, warm and surely rather sticky. It did not seem like the touch of the water damp, and at the same moment I knew I was not alone in the room. There was something there, something silent as yet, and as yet invisible, but it was there. Now, for the consolation of persons who are inclined to be fearful, I may say at once that I am in no way brave. But that terror, which, God knows, was real enough, was yet so interesting that interest overruled it. I stood for a moment by the other bed, and, half consciously only, wiped the hand that had felt the stain, for the touch of it, though all the time I told myself that it was but the touch of the melted snow on the coat I had put there, was unpleasant and unclean. More than that I did not feel, because in the presence of the unknown, and the perhaps awful, the sense of curiosity, one of the strongest instincts we have, came to the fore. So, rather eager to get back to my room again, I ran downstairs to get the packet of paper. There was still a light on in the bureau, and the sensitive, on night duty, I suppose, was sitting there dozing. My entrance did not disturb him, for I had on noiseless felt slippers, and seeing at once the packages I was in search of, I took it, and left him still unawakened. That was somehow of a fortifying nature. The sensitive, anyhow, could sleep in his hard chair. The occupant of the unoccupied bed was not calling to him tonight. I closed my door quietly, as one does at night when the house is silent, and sat down at once to open my packet of paper and finish my work. It was wrapped up in an old news sheet, and struggling with the last of the string that bound it, certain words caught my eye. Also the date at the top of the paper caught my eye, a date nearly a year old, or to be quite accurate, a date 51 weeks old. It was an American paper, and what it recorded was this: "The body of Mr. Silas R. Hume, who committed suicide last week at the Hotel Beausite, Moulins-sur-Chalon, is to be buried at his house in Boston, Mass. The inquest held in Switzerland showed that he cut his throat with a razor in an attack of delirium tremens induced by drink. In the cupboard of his room were found 36 empty bottles of Scotch whiskey." So far I had read, when without warning the electric light went out, and I was left in, what seemed for the moment, absolute darkness. And again I knew I was not alone, and I knew now who it was who was with me in the room. Then the absolute paralysis of fear seized me. As if a wind had blown over my head, I felt the hair of it stir and rise a little. My eyes also, I suppose, became accustomed to the sudden darkness, for they could now perceive the shape of the furniture in the room from the light of the starlit sky outside. They saw more too than the mere furniture. There was, standing by the washstand between the two windows, a figure, clothed only in night garments, and its hands moved among the objects on the shelf above the basin. Then, with 2 steps, it made a sort of dive for the other bed, which was in shadow, and then the sweat poured onto my forehead. Though the other bed stood in shadow, I could still see dimly, but sufficiently, what was there. The shape of a head lay on the pillow. The shape of an arm lifted its hand to the electric bell that was close by on the wall, and I fancied I could hear it distantly ringing. Then a moment later came hurrying feet up the stairs and along the passage outside, and a quick rapping at my door. "Monsieur's whiskey, monsieur's whiskey," said a voice just outside. "Pardon, monsieur, I brought it as quickly as I could." The impotent paralysis of cold terror was still on me. Once I tried to speak and failed, and still the gentle tapping went on at the door, and the voice telling someone that his whiskey was there. Then at a second attempt, I heard a voice, which was mine, saying hoarsely, "For God's sake, come in. I am alone with it." There was the click of a turned door handle, and as suddenly as it had gone out a few seconds before, the electric light came back again and the room was in full illumination. I saw a face peer round the corner of the door, but it was at another face I looked, the face of a man sallow and shrunken, who lay in the other bed, staring at me with glazed eyes. He lay high in bed, and his throat was cut from ear to ear, and the lower part of the pillow was soaked in blood, and the sheet streamed with it. Then suddenly that hideous vision vanished, and there was only a sleepy-eyed waiter looking into the room, but below the sleepiness, terror was awake, and his voice shook when he spoke. "Monsieur rang?" he asked. No, monsieur had not rung, but monsieur made himself a couch in the billiard room. End of section 15. Recording by Noel Vox.
Story 16 of The Room in the Tower and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrew Gauntz. The Room in the Tower and Other Stories by E.F. Benson. The Thing in the Hall. The following pages are the account given me by Dr. Ashton of The Thing in the Hall. I took notes as copious as my quickness of hand allowed me from his dictation, and subsequently read to him this narrative in its transcribed and connected form. This was on the day before his death, which indeed probably occurred within an hour after I had left him, and as readers of inquests and such atrocious literature may remember, I had to give evidence before the coroner's jury. Only a week before Dr. Ashton had to give similar evidence, but as a medical expert, with regard to the death of his friend, Louis Fielder, which occurred in a manner identical with his own. As a specialist, he said he believed that his friend had committed suicide while of unsound mind, and the verdict was brought in accordingly. But in the inquest held over Dr. Ashton's body, though the verdict eventually returned was the same, there was more room for doubt. For I was bound to state that only shortly before his death I read what follows to him, that he corrected me with extreme precision on a few points of detail, that he seemed perfectly himself, and that at the end he used these words: "I am quite certain as a brain specialist that I am completely sane, and that these things happened not merely in my imagination, but in the external world. If I had to give evidence again about poor Louis, I should be compelled to take a different line. Please put that down at the end of your account, or at the beginning if it arranges itself better so. There will be a few words I must add at the end of this story, and a few words of explanation must precede it. Briefly, they are these. Francis Ashton and Louis Fielder were up at Cambridge together, and there formed the friendship that lasted nearly till their death. In general attributes, no two men could have been less alike, for while Dr. Ashton had become at the age of 35 the first and final authority on his subject, which was the functions and diseases of the brain, Louis Fielder at the same age was still on the threshold of achievement. Ashton, apparently without any brilliance at all, had by careful and incessant work arrived at the top of his profession, while Fielder, brilliant at school, brilliant at college, and brilliant ever afterwards, had never done anything. He was too eager, so it seemed to his friends, to set about the dreary work of patient investigation and logical deductions. He was forever guessing and prying and striking out luminous ideas which he left burning, so to speak, to illumine the work of others. But at bottom, the two men had this compelling interest in common, namely an insatiable curiosity after the unknown, perhaps the most potent bond yet devised between the solitary units that make up the race of man. Both, till the end, were absolutely fearless, and Dr. Ashton would sit by the bedside of a man stricken with bubonic plague to note the gradual surge of the tide of disease to the reasoning faculty, with the same absorption as Fielder would study X-rays one week, flying machines the next, and spiritualism the third. The rest of the story, I think, explains itself, or does not quite do so. This, anyhow, is what I read to Dr. Ashton, being the connected narrative of what he had himself told me. It is he, of course, who speaks. After I returned from Paris, where I had studied under Charcot, I set up practice at home. The general doctrine of hypnotism, suggestion, and cure by such means had been accepted even in London by this time, and owing to a few papers I had written on the subject, together with my foreign diplomas, I found that I was a busy man almost as soon as I had arrived in town. Louis Fielder had his ideas about how I should make my debut, for he had ideas on every subject, and all of them original, and entreated me to come and live not in the stronghold of doctors, Chloroform Square as he called it, but down in Chelsea, where there was a house vacant next his own. "Who cares where a doctor lives," he said, "so long as he cures people? Besides, you don't believe in old methods, why believe in old localities? Oh, there is an atmosphere of painless death in Chloroform Square. Come and make people live instead, and on most evenings I shall have so much to tell you, I can't drop in across half London." Now, if you have been abroad for 5 years, it is a great deal to know that you have any intimate friend at all still left in the metropolis, and, as Louis said, to have that intimate friend next door is an excellent reason for going next door. Above all, I remembered from Cambridge days what Louis's dropping in meant. Towards bedtime, when work was over, there would come a rapid step on the landing, and for an hour or 2 hours he would gush with ideas. He simply diffused life, which is ideas, wherever he went. He fed one's brain, which is the one thing which matters. Most people who are ill because their brain is starving, and the body rebels and gets lumbago or cancer. That is the chief doctrine of my work, such as it has been. All bodily disease springs from the brain. It is merely the brain that has to be fed and rested and exercised properly to make the body absolutely healthy and immune from all disease. But when the brain is affected, it is as useful to pour medicines down the sink as make your patient swallow them, unless, and this is a paramount limitation, unless he believes in them. I said something of the kind to Louis one night, when, at the end of a busy day, I had dined with him. We were sitting over coffee in the hall, or so it is called, where he takes his meals. Outside, his house is just like mine and 10,000 other small houses in London, but on entering, instead of finding a narrow passage with a door on one side leading into the dining room, which again communicates with a small back room called the study, he has had the sense to eliminate all unnecessary walls, and consequently, the whole ground floor of his house is one room, with stairs leading up to the first floor. Study, dining room, and passage have been knocked into one. You enter a big room from the front door. The only drawback is that the postman makes loud noises close to you as you dine, and just as I made these commonplace observations to him about the effect of the brain on the body and the senses, there came a loud rap somewhere close to me that was startling. "You ought to muffle your knocker," I said. "Anyhow, during the time of meals." Louis leaned back and laughed. "There isn't a knocker," he said. "You were startled a week ago and said the same thing, so I took the knocker off. The letters slide in now. But you heard a knock, did you?" "Didn't you?" said I. "Why, certainly. But it wasn't the postman. It was the thing. I don't know what it is. That makes it so interesting." Now, if there is one thing that the hypnotist, the believer in unexplained influences, detests and despises, it is the whole root notion of spiritualism. Drugs are not more opposed to his belief than the exploded, discredited idea of the influence of spirits on our lives. And both are discredited for the same reason. It is easy to understand how brain can act on brain, just as it is easy to understand how body can act on body. so that there is no more difficulty in the reception of the idea that the strong mind can direct the weak one than there is in the fact of a wrestler of greater strength overcoming one of less. But that spirits should rap at furniture and divert the course of events is as absurd as administering phosphorus to strengthen the brain. That was what I thought then. However, I felt sure it was the postman, and instantly rose and went to the door. There were no letters in the box, and I opened the door. The postman was just ascending the steps. He gave the letters into my hand. Louis was sipping his coffee when I came back to the table. "Have you ever tried table-turning?" he asked. "It's rather odd." "No, and I have not tried violet leaves as a cure for cancer," I said. "Oh, try everything," he said. "I know that is your plan, just as it is mine. All these years that you have been away, you have tried all sorts of things, first with no faith, then with just a little faith, and finally with mountain-moving faith. Why, you didn't believe in hypnotism at all when you went to Paris." He rang the bell as he spoke, and his servant came up and cleared the table. While this was being done, we strolled about the room looking at prints, with applause for a Bartolozzi that Louis had bought in the New Cut, and dead silence over a Perdita, which he had acquired at considerable cost. Then he sat down again at the table on which we had dined. It was round and mahogany-heavy, with a central foot divided into claws. "Try its weight," he said. "See if you can push it about." So I held the edge of it in my hands and found that I could just move it. But that was all. It required the exercise of a good deal of strength to stir it. "Now put your hands on the top of it," he said, "and see what you can do." I could not do anything. My fingers merely slipped about on it. But I protested at the idea of spending the evening thus. "I would much sooner play chess or noughts and crosses with you," I said, "or even talk about politics than turn tables. You won't mean to push, nor shall I, but we shall push without meaning to." Louis nodded. "Just a minute," he said. "Let us both put our fingers only on the top of the table and push for all we are worth from right to left." We pushed. At least, I pushed, and I observed his fingernails. From pink they grew to white because of the pressure he exercised, so I must assume that he pushed too. Once, as we tried this, the table creaked, but it did not move. Then there came a quick peremptory rap, not, I thought, on the front door, but somewhere in the room. "It's the thing," said he. Today, as I speak to you, I suppose it was. But on that evening it seemed only like a challenge. I wanted to demonstrate its absurdity. "For 5 years, on and off, I've been studying rank spiritualism," he said. "I haven't told you before because I wanted to lay before you certain phenomena, which I can't explain, but which now seem to me to be at my command. You shall see and hear, and then decide if you will help me." "And in order to let me see better, you are proposing to put out the lights," I said. "Yes, you will see why." "I am here as a skeptic," said I. "Skep away," said he. Next moment the room was in darkness, except for a very faint glow of firelight. The window curtains were thick, and no street illumination penetrated them, and the familiar cheerful sounds of pedestrians and wheeled traffic came in muffled. I was at the side of the table towards the door. Louis was opposite me, for I could see his figure dimly silhouetted against the glow from the smoldering fire. "Put your hands on the table," he said, "quite lightly, and, how shall I say it? Expect." Still protesting in spirit, I expected. I could hear his breathing rather quickened, and it seemed to me odd that anybody could find excitement in standing in the dark over a large mahogany table, expecting. Then, through my fingertips laid lightly on the table, there began to come a faint vibration, like nothing so much as the vibration through the handle of a kettle when water is beginning to boil inside it. This got gradually more pronounced and violent, till it was like the throbbing of a motor car. It seemed to give off a low humming note. Then, quite suddenly, the table seemed to slip from under my fingers, and began very slowly to revolve. "Keep your hands on it, and move with it," said Louis. And as he spoke, I saw his silhouette pass away from in front of the fire, moving as the table moved. For some moments there was silence, and we continued, rather absurdly, to circle round, keeping step, so to speak, with the table. Then Louis spoke again, and his voice was trembling with excitement. "Are you there?" he said. There was no reply, of course, and he asked it again. This time there came a rap like that which I had thought during dinner to be the postman. But whether it was that the room was dark, or that despite myself I felt rather excited too, it seemed to me to be far louder than before. Also, it appeared to come neither from here nor there, but to be diffused through the room. Then the curious revolving of the table ceased, but the intense, violent throbbing continued. My eyes were fixed on it, though owing to the darkness I could see nothing, when quite suddenly a little speck of light moved across it, so that for an instant I saw my own hands. Then came another, and another, like the spark of matches struck in the dark, or like fireflies crossing the dusk in southern gardens. Then came another knock of shattering loudness, and the throbbing of the table ceased, and the lights vanished. Such were the phenomena at the first séance at which I was present. But Fielder, it must be remembered, had been studying expecting, as he called it, for some years. To adopt spiritualistic language, which at that time I was very far from doing, he was the medium, I merely the observer, and all the phenomena I had seen that night were habitually produced or witnessed by him. I make this limitation since he told me that certain of them now appeared to be outside his own control altogether. The knockings would come when his mind, as far as he knew, was entirely occupied in other matters, and sometimes he had even been awakened out of sleep by them. The lights were also independent of his volition. Now, my theory at the time was that all these things were purely subjective in him, and that what he expressed by saying that they were out of his control meant that they had become fixed and rooted in the unconscious self, of which we know so little but which more and more we see to play an enormous part in the life of a man. In fact, it is not too much to say that the vast majority of our deeds spring, apparently without volition, from this unconscious self. All hearing is the unconscious exercise of the oral nerve, all seeing of the optic, all walking, all ordinary movement seem to be done without the exercise of will on our part. Nay more, should we take to some new form of progression, skating for instance, the beginner will learn with falls and difficulty the outside edge, but within a few hours of his having learned his balance on it, he will give no more thought to what he learned so short a time ago as an acrobatic feat than he gives to the placing of one foot before the other. But to the brain specialist, all this was intensely interesting, and to the student of hypnotism, as I was, even more so, for, such was the conclusion I came to after this first séance, the fact that I saw and heard just what Louis saw and heard was an exhibition of thought transference, which in all my experience in the Charcot schools I had never seen surpassed, if indeed rivaled. I knew that I was myself extremely sensitive to suggestion, and my part in it this evening I believed to be purely that of the receiver of suggestions so vivid that I visualized and heard these phenomena, which existed only in the brain of my friend. We talked over what had occurred upstairs. His view was that the thing was trying to communicate with us. According to him, it was the thing that moved the table and tapped, and made us see streaks of light. "Yes, but the thing," I interrupted. "What do you mean? Is it a great-uncle? Oh, I have seen so many relatives appear at séances and heard so many of their dreadful platitudes. Or what is it, a spirit? Whose spirit?" Louis was sitting opposite to me, and on the little table before us there was an electric light. Looking at him, I saw the pupil of his eye suddenly dilate. To the medical man, provided that some violent change in the light is not the cause of the dilation, that meant only one thing: terror. But it quickly resumed its normal proportion again. Then he got up and stood in front of the fire. "No, I don't think it is great-uncle anybody," he said. "I don't know, as I told you, what the thing is. But if you ask me what my conjecture is, it is that the thing is an elemental." "And pray explain further, what is an elemental?" Once again his eye dilated. "It will take 2 minutes," he said. "But listen. There are good things in this world, are there not, and bad things? Cancer, I take it, is bad, and fresh air is good. Honesty is good, lying is bad. Impulses of some sort direct both sides, and some power suggests the impulses. Well, I went into this spiritualistic business impartially. I learned to expect, to throw open the door into the soul, and I said anyone may come in. And I think something has applied for admission. The thing that tapped and turned the table and struck matches as you saw across it. Now the control of the evil principle in the world is in the hands of a power which entrusts its errands to the things which I call elementals. Oh, they have been seen. I doubt not that they will be seen again. I did not and do not ask good spirits to come in. I don't want the church's one foundation played on a musical box, nor do I want an elemental. I only threw open the door. I believe the thing has come into my house and is establishing communication with me. Oh, I want to go the whole hog. What is it? In the name of Satan, if necessary, what is it? I just want to know. What followed I thought then might easily be an invention of the imagination, but what I believed to have happened was this. A piano with music on it was standing at the far end of the room by the door, and a sudden draught entered the room, so strong that the leaves turned. Next, the draught troubled a vase of daffodils, and the yellow heads nodded. Then it reached the candles that stood close to us, and they fluttered, burning blue and low. Then it reached me, and the draught was cold and stirred my hair. Then it eddied, so to speak, and went across to Louis, and his hair also moved, as I could see. Then it went downwards towards the fire, and flames suddenly started up in its path, blown upwards. The rug by the fireplace flapped also. "Funny, wasn't it?" he asked. "And has the elemental gone up the chimney?" said I. "Oh no," said he, "the thing only passed us." Then suddenly he pointed at the wall just behind my chair, and his voice cracked as he spoke. "Look, what's that?" he said. "There on the wall." Considerably startled, I turned in the direction of his shaking finger. The wall was pale gray in tone, and sharp cut against it was a shadow that, as I looked, moved. It was like the shadow of some enormous slug, legless and fat, some 2 feet high by about 4 feet long. Only at one end of it was a head shaped like the head of a seal, with open mouth and panting tongue. Then, even as I looked, it faded, and from somewhere close at hand there sounded another of those shattering knocks. For a moment after there was silence between us, and horror was thick as snow in the air. But somehow neither Louis or I were frightened for more than one moment. The whole thing was so absorbingly interesting. "That's what I mean by it being outside my control," he said. "I said I was ready for any visitor to come in, and by God, we've got a beauty." Now, I was still, even in spite of the appearance of this shadow, quite convinced that I was only taking observations of a most curious case of disordered brain, accompanied by the most vivid and remarkable thought transference. I believed I had not seen a slug-like shadow at all, but that Louis had visualized this dreadful creature so intensely that I saw what he saw. I found also that his spiritualistic trash books, which I thought a truer nomenclature than textbooks, mentioned this as a common form for elementals to take. He, on the other hand, was more firmly convinced than ever that we were dealing not with a subjective, but an objective phenomenon. For the next 6 months or so we sat constantly, but made no further progress, nor did the thing or its shadow appear again, and I began to feel that we were really wasting time. Then it occurred to me to get in a so-called medium, induce hypnotic sleep, and see if we could learn anything further. This we did, sitting as before round the dining-room table. The room was not quite dark, and I could see sufficiently clearly what happened. The medium, a young man, sat between Louis and myself, and without the slightest difficulty I put him into a light hypnotic sleep. Instantly there came a series of the most terrific raps, and across the table there slid something more palpable than a shadow, with a faint luminance about it, as if the surface of it was smoldering. At the moment the medium's face became contorted to a mask of hellish terror. Mouth and eyes were both open, and the eyes were focused on something close to him. The thing, waving its head, came closer and closer to him, and reached out towards his throat. Then, with a yell of panic and warding off this horror with his hands, the medium sprang up, but it had already caught hold, and for the moment he could not get free. Then, simultaneously, Louis and I went to his aid, and my hands touched something cold and slimy. But pull as we could not get it away. There was no firm handhold to be taken. It was as if one tried to grasp slimy fur, and the touch of it was horrible, unclean, like a leper. Then, in a sort of despair, though I could still not believe that the horror was real, for it must be a vision of diseased imagination, I remembered that the switch of the 4 electric lights was close to my hand. I turned them all on. There, on the floor, lay the medium. Louis was kneeling by him with a face of wet paper, but there was nothing else there. Only the collar of the medium was crumpled and torn, and on his throat were 2 scratches that bled. The medium was still in hypnotic sleep, and I woke him. He felt at his collar, put his hand to his throat, and found it bleeding, but, as I expected, knew nothing whatever of what had passed. We told him that there had been an unusual manifestation, and he had, while in sleep, wrestled with something. We had got the result we wished for, and were much obliged to him. I never saw him again. A week after that he died of blood poisoning. From that evening dates the 2nd stage of this adventure. The thing had materialized. I use again spiritualistic language which I still did not use at the time. The huge slug, the elemental, manifested itself no longer by knocks and waltzing tables, nor yet by shadows. It was there in a form that could be seen and felt. But it still, this was my strong point, was only a thing of twilight. The sudden kindling of the electric light had shown us that there was nothing there. In this struggle perhaps the medium had clutched his own throat. Perhaps I had grasped Louis's sleeve, he mine. But though I said these things to myself, I am not sure that I believed them, in the same way that I believe the sun will rise tomorrow. Now, as a student of brain functions and a student in hypnotic affairs, I ought perhaps to have steadily and unremittingly pursued this extraordinary series of phenomena. But I had my practice to attend to, and I found that with the best will in the world I could think of nothing else except the occurrence in the hall next door. So I refused to take part in any further séance with Louis. I had another reason also. For the last 4 or 5 months he was becoming depraved. I have been no prude or Puritan in my own life, and I hope I have not turned a pharisaical shoulder on sinners. But in all branches of life and morals, Louis had become infamous. He was turned out of a club for cheating at cards, and narrated the event to me with gusto. He had become cruel. He tortured his cat to death. He had become bestial. I used to shudder as I passed his house, expecting I knew not what fiendish thing to be looking at me from the window. Then came a night only a week ago, when I was awakened by an awful cry, swelling and falling and rising again. It came from next door. I ran downstairs in my pajamas and out into the street. The policeman on the beat had heard it too, and it came from the hall of Louis's house, the window of which was open. Together we burst the door in. You know what we found. The screaming had ceased but a moment before, but he was dead already. Both jugulars were severed, torn open. It was dawn, early and dusky when I got back to my house next door. Even as I went in, something seemed to push by me, something soft and slimy. It could not be Louis's imagination this time. Since then, I have seen glimpses of it every evening. I am awakened at night by tappings, and in the shadows in the corner of my room there sits something more substantial than a shadow. Within an hour of my leaving Dr. Ashton, the quiet street was once more aroused by cries of terror and agony. He was already dead, and in no other manner than his friend, when they got to the house. End of The Thing in the Hall.
Story number 17 of The Room in the Tower and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sushil Chandradas. The Room in the Tower and Other Stories by E.F. Benson. The House with the Brick-Kiln. The hamlet of Trevor Major lies very lonely and sequestered in a hollow below the north side of the South Downs that stretch westward from Lewes and run parallel with the coast. It is a hamlet of some 3 or 4 dozen inconsiderable houses and cottages, much girt about with trees, but the big Norman church and the manor house which stands a little outside the village are evidence of a more conspicuous past. This latter, except for a tenancy of rather less than 3 weeks, now 4 years ago, has stood unoccupied since the summer of 1896. And though it could be taken at a rent almost comically small, it is highly improbable that either of its last tenants, even if times were very bad, would think of passing a night in it again. For myself, I was one of the tenants. I would far prefer living in a workhouse to inhabiting these low-pitched, oak-panelled rooms, and I would sooner look from my garret windows onto the squalor and grime of Whitechapel than from the diamond-shaped and leaded panes of the manor of Trevor Major, onto the boscage of its cool thickets and the glimmering of its clear chalk streamy where the quick trout glance among the waving water weeds and over the chalk and gravel of its sliding rapids. It was the news of these trout that led Jack Singleton and myself to take the house for a month between mid-May and mid-June. But as I have already mentioned, a short 3 weeks was all the time we passed there, and we had more than a week of our tenancy yet unexpired when we left the place, though on the very last afternoon we enjoyed the finest dry fly fishing that has ever fallen to my lot. Singleton had originally seen the advertisement of the house in a Sussex paper, with the statement that there was good dry fly fishing belonging to it. But it was with but faint hopes of the reality of the dry fly fishing that we went down to the place, since we had before this so often inspected depopulated ditches, which were offered to the unwary under high-sounding titles. Yet, after a half-hour's stroll by the stream, we went straight back to the agent and before nightfall had taken it for a month with option of renewal. We arrived accordingly from town at about 5 o'clock on a cloudless afternoon in May, and through the mists of horror that now stand between me and the remembrance of what occurred later, I cannot forget the exquisite loveliness of the impression then conveyed. The garden, it is true, appeared to have been for years untended. Weeds half choked the gravel paths, and the flower beds were a congestion of mingled wild and cultivated vegetations. It was set in a wall of mellowed brick, in which snapdragon and stonecrop had found an anchorage to their liking, and beyond that there stood sentinel, a ring of ancient pines in which the breeze made music as of a distant sea. Outside that, the ground sloped slightly downwards in a bank, covered with a jungle of wild rose, to the stream that ran round 3 sides of the garden and then followed a meandering course through the 2 big fields which lay towards the village. Over all this we had fishing rights. Above, the same rise extended for another 1/4 of a mile to the arched bridge, over which there crossed the road which led to the house. In this field above the house on the 4th side, where the ground had been embanked to carry the road, stood a brick-kiln in a ruinous state. A shallow pit, long overgrown with tall grasses and wild field flowers, showed where the clay had been digged. The house itself was long and narrow. Entering, you passed direct into a square panel hall, on the left of which was the dining room, which communicated with the passage leading to the kitchen and offices. On the right of the hall were 2 excellent sitting rooms looking out. The one onto the gravel in front of the house, the other onto the garden. From the first of these, you could see through the gap in the pines by which the road approached the house, the brick-kiln of which I have already spoken. An oak staircase went up from the hall, and round it ran a gallery onto which the 3 principal bedrooms opened. These were commensurate with the dining room and the 2 sitting rooms below. From this gallery there led a long, narrow passage, shut off from the rest of the house by a red baize door, which led to a couple more guest rooms and the servants' quarters. Jack Singleton and I shared the same flat in town, and we had set down in the morning Franklin and his wife, two old and valued servants, to get things ready at Trevor Major, and procure help from the village to look after the house. And Mrs. Franklin, with a stout, comfortable face, all wreathed in smiles, opened the door to us. She had come down prepared for the worst, but found it all of the best. The kitchen boiler was not furred, hot and cold water were laid on in the most convenient fashion, and could be obtained from taps that neither stuck nor leaked. Her husband, it appeared, had gone into the village to buy a few necessaries, and she brought up tea for us, and then went upstairs to the two rooms over the dining room and bigger sitting room, which we had chosen for our bedrooms, to unpack. The doors of these were exactly opposite one another, to right and left of the gallery, and Jack, who chose the bedroom above the sitting room, had thus a smaller room above the second sitting room, unoccupied next his, and opening out from it. We had a couple of hours fishing before dinner, each of us catching 3 or 4 brace of trout, and came back in the dusk to the house. Franklin had returned from the village from his errand, reported that he had got a woman to come in to do housework in the mornings, and mentioned that our arrival had seemed to arouse a great deal of interest. The reason for this was obscure. He could only tell us that he was questioned a dozen times as to whether we really intended to live in the house, and his assurance that we did produced silence and a shaking of heads. But the country folk of Sussex are notable for their silence and chronic attitude of disapproval, and we put this down to local idiosyncrasy. The evening was exquisitely warm, and after dinner we pulled out a couple of basket chairs onto the gravel by the front door, and sat for an hour or so while the night deepened in throbs of gathering darkness. The moon was not risen, and the ring of pines cut off much of the pale starlight, so that when we went in, allured by the shining of the lamp in the sitting room, it was curiously dark for a clear night in May. And at that moment of stepping from the darkness into the cheerfulness of the lighted house, I had a sudden sensation to which, during the next fortnight, I became almost accustomed, of there being something unseen and unheard and dreadful near me. In spite of the warmth, I felt myself shiver, and concluded instantly that I had sat out of doors long enough, and without mentioning it to Jack, followed him into the smaller sitting room in which we had scarcely yet set foot. It, like the hall, was oak-panelled, and in the panels hung some half-dozen of watercolor sketches, which we examined idly at first, and then with growing interest, for they were executed with extraordinary finish and delicacy, and each represented some aspect of the house or garden. Here you looked up the gap in the fir trees into a crimson sunset. Here the garden, trim and carefully tended, dozed beneath some languid summer noon. Here an angry wreath of storm cloud brooded over the meadow where the trout stream ran grey and leaden below a threatening sky, while another, the most careful and arresting of all, was a study of the Brick-Kiln. In this alone of them all was there a human figure. A man, dressed in grey, peered into the open door from which there issued a fierce red glow. The figure was painted with miniature-like elaboration. The face was in profile and represented a youngish man, clean-shaven, with a long aquiline nose and singularly square chin. The sketch was long and narrow in shape, and the chimney of the kiln appeared against a dark sky. From it there issued a thin streamer of grey smoke. Jack looked at this with attention. "What a horrible picture," he said, "and how beautifully painted. I feel as if it meant something, as it was a representation of something that happened, not a mere sketch. By Jove!" He broke off suddenly and went in turn to each of the other pictures. "That's a queer thing," he said. "See if you notice what I mean." With the Brick-Kiln rather vividly impressed upon my mind, it was not difficult to see what he had noticed. In each of the pictures appeared the Brick-Kiln, chimney and all, now seen faintly between trees now in full view, and in each the chimney was smoking. And the odd part is that from the garden side you can't really see the kiln at all, observed Jack. It's hidden by the house, and yet the artist, F.A., as I see by his signature, puts it in just the same. What do you make of that? I asked. Nothing. I suppose he had a fancy for brick-kilns. Let's have a game of piquet. A fortnight of our 3 weeks passed without incident, except that again and again the curious feeling of something dreadful being close at hand was present in my mind. In a way, as I said, I got used to it, but on the other hand, the feeling itself seemed to gain in poignancy. Once, just at the end of the fortnight, I mentioned it to Jack. Odd you should speak of it, he said, because I felt the same. When do you feel it? Do you feel it now, for instance? We were again sitting out after dinner, and as he spoke, I felt it with a far greater intensity than ever before. And at the same moment, the house door, which had been closed, though probably not latched, swung gently open, letting out a shaft of light from the hall, and as gently swung to again, as if something had stealthily entered. Yes, I said. I felt it then. I only feel it in the evening. It was rather bad that time. Jack was silent a moment. Funny thing, the door opening and shutting like that, he said. Let's go indoors. We got up, and I remember seeing at that moment that the windows of my bedroom were lit. Mrs. Franklin was probably making things ready for the night. Simultaneously, as we crossed the gravel, there came from just inside the house the sound of hurried footsteps on the stairs, and entering we found Mrs. Franklin in the hall, looking rather white and startled. Anything wrong? I asked. She took 2 or 3 quick breaths before she answered. No, sir, she said. At least nothing that I can give an account of. I was tidying up in your room and I thought you came in, but there was nobody, and it gave me a turn. I left my candle there. I must go up for it. I waited in the hall a moment while she again ascended the stairs and passed along the gallery to my room. At the door, which I could see was open, she paused, not entering. What is the matter? I asked from below. I left the candle alight, she said, and it's gone out. Jack laughed. And you left the door and window open? Said he. Yes, sir, but not a breath of wind is stirring, said Mrs. Franklin, rather faintly. This was true, and yet, a few moments ago, the heavy hall door had swung open and back again. Jack ran upstairs. We'll brave the dark together, Mrs. Franklin, he said. He went into my room, and I heard the sound of a match struck. Then, through the open door, came the light of the rekindled candle, and simultaneously I heard a bell ring in the servants' quarters. In a moment, steps came, and Franklin appeared. What bell was that? I asked. Mr. Jack's bedroom, sir, he said. I felt there was a marked atmosphere of nerves about for which there was really no adequate cause. All that had happened of a disturbing nature was that Mrs. Franklin had thought I had come into my bedroom, and had been startled by finding out I had not. She had then left the candle in a draught, and it had been blown out. As for a bell ringing, that, even if it had happened, was a very innocuous proceeding. Mouse on a wire, I said. Mr. Jack is in my room this moment, lighting Mrs. Franklin's candle for her. Jack came down at this juncture, and we went into the sitting room. But Franklin apparently was not satisfied, for we heard him in the room above us, which was Jack's bedroom, moving about with his slow and rather ponderous tread. Then his steps seemed to pass into the bedroom adjoining, and we heard no more. I remember feeling hugely sleepy that night, and went to bed earlier than usual, to pass rather a broken night with stretches of dreamless sleep, interspersed with startled awakenings in which I passed very suddenly into complete consciousness. Sometimes the house was absolutely still, and the only sound to be heard was the sighing of the night breeze outside in the pines. But sometimes the place seemed full of muffled movements, and once I could have sworn that the handle of my door turned. That required verification, and I lit my candle, but found that my ears must have played me false. Yet, even as I stood there, I thought I heard steps just outside, and with a considerable qualm, I must confess, I opened the door and looked out. But the gallery was quite empty, and the house quite still. Then, from Jack's room opposite, I heard a sound that was somehow comforting, the snorts of the snorer. And I went back to bed and slept again. And when next I awoke, morning was already breaking in red lines on the horizon, and the sense of trouble that had been with me ever since the last evening had gone. Heavy rain set in after lunch next day, and as I had arrears of letter writing to do, and the water was soon both muddy and rising, I came home alone about 5, leaving Jack still sanguine by the stream, and worked for a couple of hours, sitting at a writing table in the room overlooking the gravel at the front of the house, where hung the watercolors. By 7 I had finished, and just as I got up to light the candle, since it was already dusk, I saw, as I thought, Jack's figure emerge from the bushes that bordered the path to the stream, onto the space in front of the house. Then instantaneously and with sudden, queer sinking of the heart, quite unaccountable, I saw that it was not Jack at all, but a stranger. He was only some 6 yards from the window, and after pausing there a moment, he came close to the window so that his face nearly touched the glass, looking intently at me. In the light from the freshly kindled candles, I could distinguish his features with great clearness, but though, as far as I knew, I had never seen him before, there was something familiar about both his face and feature. He appeared to smile at me, but the smile was one of inscrutable evil and malevolence, and immediately he walked on, straight towards the house door opposite him, and out of sight of the sitting-room window. Now, little though I liked the look of the man, he was, as I have said, familiar to my eye, and I went out into the hall, since he was clearly coming to the front door, to open it to him and learn his business. So without waiting for him to ring, I opened it, feeling sure I should find him on the step. Instead, I looked out into the empty gravel sweep, the heavy rain falling, the thick dusk. And even as I looked, I felt something that I could not see push by me through the half-open door and pass into the house. Then the stairs creaked, and a moment after, a bell rang. Franklin is the quickest man to answer a bell I have ever seen, and next instant he passed me going upstairs. He tapped at Jack's door, entered, and then came down again. "Mr. Jack still out, sir?" he asked. "Yes." "Is bell ringing again?" "Yes, sir," said Franklin, quite imperturbably. I went back into the sitting room, and soon Franklin brought a lamp. He put it on the table above which hung the careful and curious picture of the Brick-Kiln, and then with a sudden horror, I saw why the stranger on the gravel outside had been so familiar to me. In all respects, he resembled the figure that peered into the kiln. It was more than a resemblance. It was an identity. And what had happened to this man who had inscrutably and evilly smiled at me? And what had pushed in through the half-closed door? At that moment, I saw the face of fear. My mouth went dry, and I heard my heart leaping and cracking in my throat. That face was only turned on me for a moment, and then away again, but I knew it to be the genuine thing. Not apprehension, not foreboding, not a feeling of being startled, but fear. Cold fear. And then, though nothing had occurred to assuage the fear, it passed, and a certain sort of reason usurped, for so I must say, its place. I had certainly seen somebody on the gravel outside the house. I had supposed he was going to the front door. I had opened it, and found he had not come to the front door. Or, and once again the terror resurged, had the invisible pushing thing been that which I had seen outside? And if so, what was it? And how came it that the face and figure of the man I had seen was the same as which was so scrupulously painted in the picture of the Brick-Kiln? I had set myself to argue down the fear, for which there was no more foundation than this. This, and the repetition of the ringing bell, and my belief is that I did so. I told myself till I believed it, that a man, a human man, had been walking across the gravel outside, and that he had not come to the front door but had gone, as he might easily have done, up the drive into the high road. I told myself that it was mere fancy that was the cause of the belief, that something had pushed in by me, and as for the ringing of the bell, I said it to myself, as was true, that this had happened before. And I must ask the reader to believe also that I argued these things away and looked no longer on the face of fear itself. I was not comfortable, but I fell short of being terrified. I sat down again by the window, looking onto the gravel in front of the house, and finding another letter that asked, though it did not demand an answer, proceeded to occupy myself with it. Straight in front led the drive through the gap in the pines and passed through the field where lay the Brick-Kiln. In a pause of page turning, I looked up and saw something unusual about it. At the same moment, an unusual smell came to my nostril. What I saw was smoke coming out of the chimney of the kiln. What I smelt was the odor of roasting meat. The wind, such as there was, set from the kiln to the house, but as far as I knew, the smell of roast meat probably came from the kitchen, where dinner, so I supposed, was cooking. I had to tell myself this. I wanted reassurance, lest the face of fear should look whitely on me again. Then there was a crisp step on the gravel and a rattle at the front door, and Jack came in. "Good sport," he said. "You gave up too soon." And he went straight to the table above which hung the picture of the man at the brick-kiln and looked at it. Then there was silence. And eventually I spoke, for I wanted to know one thing. "Seen anybody?" I asked. "Yes." "Why do you ask?" "Because I have also. The man in that picture." Jack came and sat down near me. "It's a ghost, you know," he said. He came down to the river about dusk and stood near me for an hour. At first I thought he was real, and I warned him that he had better stand further off if he didn't want to be hooked. And then it struck me he wasn't real, and I cast, right through him, and about 7 he walked up towards the house. Were you frightened? No. It was so tremendously interesting. So you saw him here too? Whereabouts? Just outside. I think he's in the house now. Jack looked round. Did you see him come in? He asked. No, but I felt him. There's another queer thing too. The chimney of the brick-kiln is smoking. Jack looked out of the window. It was nearly dark, but the wreathing smoke could just be seen. So it is, he said. Fat, greasy smoke. I think I'll go up and see what's on. Come too? I think not, I said. Are you frightened? It isn't worthwhile. Besides, it's so tremendously interesting. Jack came back from his little expedition still interested. He had found nothing stirring at the kiln, but though it was then nearly dark, the interior was faintly luminous, and against the black of the sky he could see a wisp of thick white smoke floating northwards. But for the rest of the evening, we neither heard nor saw anything of abnormal import, and the next day ran a course of undisturbed hours. Then suddenly, a hellish activity was manifested. That night, while I was undressing for bed, I heard a bell ring furiously, and I thought I heard a shout also. I guessed where the ring came from, since Franklin and his wife had long ago gone to bed and went straight to Jack's room. But as I tapped at the door, I heard his voice from inside, calling loud to me. Take care, it said. He's close to the door. A sudden qualm of blank fear took hold of me, but mastering it as best I could, I opened the door to enter, and once again something pushed softly by me, though I saw nothing. Jack was standing by his bed, half undressed. I saw him wipe his forehead with the back of his hand. He was here again, he said. I was standing just here a minute ago when I found him close by me. He came out of the inner room, I think. Did you see what he had in his hand? I saw nothing. It was a knife, a great long carving knife. Do you mind my sleeping on the sofa in your room tonight? I got an awful turn then. There was another thing too. All round the edge of his clothes, at his collar and at his wrists, there were little flames playing, little white licking flames. But next day, again, we neither heard nor saw anything, nor that night did the sense of that dreadful presence in the house come to us. And then came the last day. We had been out till it was dark, and as I said, had such a wonderful day among the fish. On reaching home, we sat together in the sitting room, when suddenly from overhead came a tread of feet, a violent pealing of the bell, and the moment after yell, as of someone in mortal agony. The thought occurred to both of us that this might be Mrs. Franklin in terror of some fearful sight, and together we rushed up and sprang into Jack's bedroom. The doorway into the room beyond was open, and just inside it we saw the man bending over some dark huddled object. Though the room was dark, we could see him perfectly, for a light, stale and impure, seemed to come from him. He again had a long knife in his hand, and as we entered he was wiping it on the mass that lay at his feet. Then he took it up, and we saw what it was, a woman with head nearly severed, but it was not Mrs. Franklin. And then the whole thing vanished, and we were standing looking into a dark and empty room. We went downstairs without a word, and it was not till we were both in the sitting room below that Jack spoke. "And he takes her to the Brick-Kiln," he said rather unsteadily. "I say, have you had enough of this house? I have. There is hell in it." About a week later, Jack put into my hand a guidebook to Sussex, open at the description of Trevor Major, and I read, "Just outside the village stands the picturesque manor house, once the home of the artist and notorious murderer Francis Adam. It was here he killed his wife in a fit, it is believed, of groundless jealousy, cutting her throat and disposing of her remains by burning them in a brick-kiln. Certain charred fragments found 6 months afterwards led to his arrest and execution. So, I prefer to leave the house with the brick-kiln and the pictures signed F.A. to others." End of The House with the Brick-Kiln. End of The Room in the Tower and Other Stories by E.F. Benson.